You've likely heard of Project 2025. It is a set of conservative policy recommendations for former President Donald Trump if he does become the next president. Now, Trump says he is not directly involved in it, and he has publicly tried to distance himself from it. However, Democrats have consistently attacked Trump's ties to the plan. Biden has labelled it, quote, the biggest attack on our system of government that has ever been proposed in the history of this country. And he has also pointed to the fact that some of Trump's top advisors have been involved. In today's deep dive, we are going to explain exactly what you need to know about Project 2025.
Billi, I really feel like Project 2025 popped up out of nowhere. I mean, to me at least, popped out of nowhere, but is now everywhere. I'm seeing it every time I look at my phone, every time I turn on the news. Can you just take it back a step and just explain what the context to this Project 2025 actually is?
Well, I'll explain where some people might have seen it around. So I've personally been seeing it a lot in the Democrats' ads. Joe Biden's ads, when they are critiquing Donald Trump, are talking about Project 2025 a lot. When I first saw it, it was just like a 3-second clip of Joe Biden saying Project 2025, look it up. It was giving conspiracy theories. And so it really required a fact-check deep dive, I think, by the Daily Aus. And now I'm seeing it much more in mainstream media. You know, the ABC's Four Corners did a deep dive into it this week. The New York Times have done several explainers on it. So I think it's time for the Daily Aus to do it.
I think so too. So without further ado, what the hell is Project 2025?
So basically, it is a set of conservative policy recommendations for the next Republican president in the US, who they believe will be Donald Trump. And it's basically just an outline of proposals, and I think that's the key word here, proposals, for what Donald Trump could do if he does become the next president at the election later this year.
Okay, so it's not the Republican Party's formal proposals, right? Who's actually behind Project 2025?
No, so it was organised by the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing policy advocacy group with the support of more than 100 conservative organisations. And Project 2025 has been worked on by hundreds of conservative policy advisors. So this is not directly Trump or the Republican Party. It's a think tank called the Heritage Foundation.
Well, they're getting good traction.
Yes, but some people listening may not have heard of them. I personally hadn't heard of them before this, but they're not new. They have
the Heritage Foundation.
No, they're not new. They have actually helped shape the policies of Republican presidents in the US since Ronald Reagan, who was the president in the US in the 80s. And Reagan really put this group on the map. I was actually looking at Reagan's official website run by his foundation before, and it very clearly states that the Heritage Foundation was his favorite think tank and that he really embodied their ideas and principles. And what I found a really interesting stat is that throughout his presidency, the Heritage Foundation made 2,000 recommendations to Reagan, and he adopted 2/3 of those 2,000 recommendations.
Wow. So they had and certainly seem to still have a lot of influence over the Republican presidents of the day.
Exactly. So all of this is to say that they aren't a new group. And actually, when Trump was elected in 2016, by 2018, the Heritage Foundation said that of the 300 policy recommendations they had made to the Trump administration at the time, he had adopted 2/3 of them as well. So not only have they had this ongoing influence over Republican presidents in the US, they also have historically had influence over Trump's policies.
The policies that they're putting forward aren't Trump's policies, right? Or at least in a formal sense, they're not his policy agenda.
No, they're not his formal policy agenda. And also, he has tried to somewhat distance himself from it.
I do want to get to that because I think that that's the most interesting part of this kind of entire scenario and this entire story. But I think we need to just go through exactly what the policies included in this Project 2025 actually are. So can you just take us through at a high level what they are?
Yeah, I'll start really broad and then we can get into a few different examples. So at a really top level, it wants to undo, quote, the damage the left has wrought. So referencing the Biden administration. And they want to do that through making really big policy changes from those adopted by the Biden administration in areas like immigration, abortion, defense, tax, and education policies. Now, Project 2025 has 4 main pillars, but we're just going to focus on the first one, which is the policy agenda, because that is what most people are talking about, and it's what tells us exactly their plan in terms of those different policy areas. Disclaimer, it is a 900-page document, so obviously we can't go through all of the policy
10 hours
areas.
later.
Yes, but we're just going to go through a couple that I think were interesting. So firstly, on immigration, they use extremely conservative language. The group wants to increase funding for a wall on the US-Mexico border. And of course, that is one of Trump's key policy areas, that wall. And they say that the border should be sealed. That's a quote. On abortion, it is very against abortion. For example, it states, quote, "From the moment of conception, every human being possesses inherent dignity and worth." And it states that all, quote, "health activities should be rooted in a deep respect for innocent human life from day one until natural death." And it wants to see abortion pills pulled from the market and greater restrictions imposed on abortion across the US. It also talks about, quote, identity politics, and it states that, quote, "Radical actors are promoting harmful identity politics," by which they mean trans people, and, quote, "bases a person's worth on their race, sex, or other identities." They say this, quote, "threatens Americans' fundamental liberties as well as the health and well-being of children and adults alike, and has called for a policy that, quote, protects children's minds and bodies and respects parents' basic right to direct the upbringing, education, and care of their children." So when we talk about their education policy, that is really what they're focused on, is identity politics, what they're calling it. Now, on climate change, the group says that while it supports creating a better environmental tomorrow, the government needs to, quote, "stop the war on oil and natural gas." And so it wants to slash funding for renewable energy completely. And so, you know, this big transition that is kind of happening in the world away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy, it is completely against that.
Okay, so some fairly significant policy proposals laid out there. I mean, when I listen to them laid out that way, they do sound not overly different to what Donald Trump has said over and over again over the years. But what has he said about this specific project?
Well, Trump claims that he, quote, knows nothing about Project 2025.
Okay.
So in a since-deleted post on his Truth Social network, he actually said, quote, "I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who is behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal."
I'd love to know which parts of that he finds ridiculous and abysmal.
Yeah, we'll get into a few of the comparisons, but he continued with that quote saying, "Anything they do, I wish them luck, but I have nothing to do with them." But there are a few things to point out. The first is that some of his closest policy advisors are involved in Project 2025 and have worked on this 900-page document. So just to give you an example, Russell T. Vought is Trump's former director of the Office of Management and Budget when Trump was president in 2017 to 2021, and he authored one of the plan's chapters. There is also Stephen Miller. He is a former Trump advisor who is also expected to return if Trump does win in November, and he has also been associated with a legal team on Project 2025 advisory board. And that's just 2 examples. There are a whole list of other people who are close to Trump and who are also heavily involved in Project 2025.
So if Trump has said that he A, knows nothing about this or claims to know nothing about this, but B, finds some of these policies to be ridiculous and abysmal, that's a very strong quote in my mind, what is his policy platform?
So Trump's policy platform is called Agenda 47. And
got less of a ring to it.
Yeah. They are 20 of his core promises if he were to become president again. And that number 47 comes from if he was elected again, he would be the 47th president of the United States.
And so what does that Agenda 47 actually outline?
Well, firstly, Agenda 47 is relatively short, particularly when you compare it to a 900-page document.
I think anything's short in comparison.
Yes. It basically is a list of 20 promises that are just explained in one sentence. They're all in capitals, which Trump loves a capital.
Yep.
But there are some similarities to Project 2025. but there are also some differences.
Okay, so let's go through the similarities first.
Okay, so one of Trump's immigration policies is to, quote, seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. And that's similar language to what I talked about before with Project 2025, which states that the border should be, quote, sealed. There's also similarities on electric vehicles. So, for example, Trump also wants to, quote, cancel the electric vehicle mandate, which is also similar to Project 2025, which says to, quote, end federal mandates and subsidies of electric vehicles.
I imagine that would be an interesting dinner time conversation for the owner of the biggest electric car manufacturer in the world, but there you go.
There are, though, also some things that Trump mentions that Project 2025 doesn't. So, for example, Trump says that one of his 20 key policy areas is to, quote, keep men out of women's sport, which isn't explicitly in Project 2025, but does have some similarities to what we were talking about before with identity politics. And he also plans to introduce, quote, large tax cuts for workers and no tax on tips, which I also couldn't find explicitly stated in Project 2025. All that to say, there are some differences. There are also a lot of similarities. I think it's fair to say that both broadly have the same kind of architecture.
Yeah.
They are very conservative agendas, but there are some differences there.
Okay, so some clear similarities. Obviously, that is in stark difference to the Democrats and to President Joe Biden, who is, of course, campaigning for re-election. We started this podcast by saying that the Democrats have included mention of Project 2025 in so many ads. What have we actually heard from President Joe Biden about this project?
Well, Biden continues to accuse Trump of having deep ties with Project 2025. He says that it is, quote, run and paid for by Trump people. At a campaign rally over the weekend in Michigan, Biden warned American voters that Project 2025 is, quote, the biggest attack on our system of government and our personal freedom that has ever been proposed in the history of this country. I've also heard Kamala Harris talk about it a lot, saying it poses a big threat to democracy in the US. So they're going very hard. And despite the fact that Trump is trying to distance himself, the Democrats are trying to link them as much as they can.
I don't remember a bigger week in American politics outside of an actual election week. And I think that this is just beginning, and we are likely to see more and more of this sort of conversation as we get closer to November. But Billi, in the same week that we had an attempted assassination on Trump, we are now talking about this policy platform that he is, saying that he has nothing to do with. So it's just fascinating.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Daily Aus, and we'll be back again on Monday.